my community, we'd have to provide the education, so I would have even have employees, right? But then it ballooned into, we have a real opportunity to provide nutrition to our communities. So this was one of the first boot camp, or no, this was the second boot camp we did. The culinary boot camp was 3 days of intensive learning, teaching, and we had it open from age 6 to whatever. Anyone was welcome. Very often, and I was really surprised, we had mostly women and girls show up. The amazing thing was they absorbed information like a sponge. And I think it had a lot to do with the model where, especially for me, I know I learned by example. You can talk to me all day, it's just not going to sink in. But if you show me and I actively go through the motions with my hands, I will remember it forever. So at the end of this intense 3-day boot camp, they all had the opportunity to cook a 3-course meal for their friends and family who bought tickets to attend the final dinner. And I can tell you that they did better than most of my professional kitchens that had been, we've been open at Black Sheep at that point for 8 years, and these guys blew that team out of the water. So understanding that creating access and opportunity for this to happen, I'm very passionate about that. And when we talk about re-educating the palate, I wanted to provide, so you can't just open a restaurant and it's like, okay, it's totally vegan, or it's totally this or that, no processed sugar, no salt, etc. I wanted to open a restaurant that had a familiar menu, but it was all made from scratch with alternative sugars and salt. So we try to use the berries, agave and maple syrup to sweeten the French toast. Didn't add any processed sugar to the whipped cream, and it was whipped there that morning. Just things like that. Get them interested and re-educate that palate so they'll be more open to new foods. They'll understand, that you can have more nutritious comfort foods. And also, when we started Blackbird, we're like, I don't know if you've been to the Navajo Res. So we're in Window Rock, Arizona, and it's like not super developed. There isn't a lot of infrastructure there. My friend has this place called Days Custom. It's a tire shop. And I was talking to him one day and I said, hey, I see you have a little office over there. What do you think about renting it to me and we can turn it into a little restaurant? He was all for it. Sure, let's do it. And my intention was to create a beautiful space like you would see in the city, but it's sitting there on this dirt lot. Tumbleweeds are going by. And I was really intentional. I wanted to show that you could create these beautiful spaces and the sense of community and the sense of pride, no matter where you were, and that you could do it on a shoestring budget. Like all of the stuff was used, everything I bought pennies on the dollar. And I use that as a model when I'm speaking to show you how you can open a beautiful restaurant with a very limited budget. So, and let me know how I'm doing on time. Am I okay?
Yeah, you so far so good. Yeah, just want time
Great.
for questions and discussion too, but
Great.
You're doing good.
So I have to tell you about how IndigiHub started. I was working at a co-working space, and it's called Kiln. It's in Lehigh, and it's a beautiful space. I had rented one of their private rooms. You were able to dim the light a little scented candle, play some music. It had this leather massage chair where the desk came and you could put your computer here. And I was working away. Felt very bougie. And I took a little break and I opened Facebook, and a childhood friend had posted, he's an entrepreneur on Navajo. And he said he was having a hard time finding a place where he could print out an application and email it back. And he went to the library, their computers were down. He went to the museum, their printer was out of ink. He went to the Division of Economic Development, and they told him he couldn't use the equipment because he wasn't an employee. So he had to travel 60 miles to a Kinko's in Gallup, where he was able to pay $15 to use the computer, printer, etc. And for me to be sitting there with so much privilege and so much access, it literally broke my heart. And so I wanted to create the model of kiln on the reservation. And our pilot space for IndigiHub, what I learned was it was going to take a lot of education and a lot of trust building in these communities. When I opened our pilot space, nobody came. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know why we were doing it. And I don't blame them. You have a lot of NGOs there promising the world, and nothing has changed since I can remember. But this was our little pilot space. And we held little classes. You had access to computers, etc. We did a lot of financial literacy. We talked about bootstrapping, and we talked about entrepreneurship. We hooked people up with mentors, and we tried to help. This kid was in college, and he did not have a driver's license, and he did not have a bank account. So I quickly began to understand that it's different there. I wanted them to understand what an entrepreneur was, and that they already had a lot of the skills necessary, and that an entrepreneur could look like many different things. I actually temporarily closed IndigiHub because I wasn't getting enough community participation. People were really just didn't trust us. So I spent a lot of time traveling, learning, working with other, like going to these very rural communities and introducing myself and talking about entrepreneurship and how we can build an economy. Talked about how we need to, share resources, share knowledge, build each other up. Started taking, speaking at other conferences and letting people know, hey, we need some help with advocacy, because people ask me all the time, what is it going to take to change? It's literally going to take an act of Congress. So advocate for us, share our stories, understand that why we're here, why we're in this situation, and as hard as we try, the obstacles that keep popping up. So I ended up joining Native Women Entrepreneurs of Arizona through this journey. I've traveled thousands of miles across almost all there's 22 reservations, or not reservations, indigenous communities in Arizona, and I've visited all but 3 of them. Ended up becoming the chairwoman for Native Women Entrepreneurs of Arizona. Was able to get into meetings with many different political figures. Most of them didn't even know we existed, and beyond that, didn't know the obstacles that we faced. So the biggest obstacle for us is infrastructure. There aren't enough buildings again, if you want to build a building, it can take years and years and years and so much money. You have to have archaeological clearance. You're sifting through, let me go ahead and close this. You're sifting through.
There's your cat.
You're sifting through 4 or 5 layers of bureaucracy, from federal to state to tribal to private, and it just crisscrosses across their land. So what's going to work is sharing resources, and that's why now I'm working on rebranding and raising funds for IndigiHub as a food incubator. One of the projects we were able to do, well, let me step back, because after we opened Blackbird, we were open there for 2 seasons, and then COVID hit. And for many communities, COVID was devastating, devastating. I was just opening a new concept in Provo, actually, when it hit, and I knew immediately, having traveled all over Arizona, I knew immediately we were in trouble, because they were telling us to socially distance, wash our hands. People don't have access to water. Our houses have multi-generational families in them, and they're often 1 to 3 bedroom structures. So it was going to make it really difficult. Plus, our healthcare system is terrible. I think we had 220 hospital beds for the entire nation. So many of the people that succumbed to COVID actually happened en route to a larger hospital. I just knew I had to do something. I started to take donations. I closed both my restaurants down. I turned them into a warehouse. I ended up connecting with like-minded individuals who had access to PPE and water tanks, and we founded Protect Native Elders, and Protect Native Elders actually ended up raising about $5 million in cash and in-kind donation. We've distributed PPE to 72 indigenous communities from Mexico to Canada. We were often the first responders to some of these. Like, we were the first one to give the Navajo Nation Police Department face shields, masks. We were the first ones giving supplies to many of our IHS hospitals. So we operated on as a kind of a rapid response support team. And we were able to do a lot of good with our mission. But as soon as the supply chains freed up a little bit and people were establishing good storage of supplies they needed, we're pivoting back to IndigiHub. And we have been a social enterprise. We have a fiscal sponsor, but now we're trying to establish as a 501c3. One of our first projects we just funded is a food processing hub. We gifted Chishi Farms, which is in Loop, Arizona, the furthest most western border. They're building a co-op in Ganado, which is on the eastern border, to connect farmers to the cooperative. And we're building them a food processing hub because they don't have any way to really process the food and get it distributed to the community. So IndigiHub will act as a food hub and concept accelerator. And the reason for that is we need investment from restaurants and food producers, from the farmers to the retail. Again, we're thinking about that farm to table, nose to tail model. We need to provide infrastructure so we can access the food from the farms and get it distributed to our communities. So that's what we're focused on now. And this has to happen on a global scale. We're about to see a real break in our food system. I think, what were they saying? We're heavily reliant on wheat, and most of the wheat is in Ukraine Russia area. So we're going to see shortages. We're going to see prices raised, etc. And a lot of my work, we try to teach canning methods, drying, freeze drying methods, and we want to provide this equipment for the community because they don't have it. They don't have this equipment. It's very expensive. And that's what IndigiHub is going to do. Even mutton can be canned and shelf stable for 18 months. So it's a necessity. It needs to happen. It needs to happen quickly. We're in a mega drought. We don't see any end to it. We've lost so much water. So we're also looking at producing microgreens for, just because it's more, it has a higher concentration of nutrition, and we can mix it in with anything, stews, tortillas, and they'll eat it. So a lot of things that we're working on. And I guess that's where we start talking about how we can help each other and move forward and change this environment, because it will benefit everyone sharing this knowledge.
Thank you, Bleu. That's, wow, there's so much to be
There's a lot
thought about and said, and just your journey has been really interesting through the restaurants and selling them so that you could be positioned better to help your people. Interestingly, be positioned better to help during COVID, particularly. Yeah, that's quite remarkable. I remember Andy Pitcher Davis put me on to you back then when you were being a responder, first responder there. Again, it strikes me that like you say, this is really a global issue. You're working on in a particularly difficult population where it's super needed, but we all either help, I think, or contribute to the problem. At least I feel this way in my own life by the food decisions I make. And so that's part of, I think, of the value of having this conversation, is how we can reflect on what we're doing, what we're buying, where we're buying it, the type of food we eat, if it's local or not, all those kind of things are food waste. I mean, it's so easy to, even if you live in an apartment, to do a compost. I mean, there's just a bajillion ways, just little things that we can do. But
absolutely,
I would, well, let's field some questions, but I would, one of my questions would be is how can someone like me or any of us here, and there's a number of people that come to this group that are activist minded, how might we better support you in what you're trying to accomplish, besides us supporting generally the concept of doing food better? So I know there's one question here. There's someone, I know Dine wants your French toast, but but Charlene Durham, and maybe this question kind of got answered for as we talked about all the terrible things, health problems that miners had with uranium and coal. But she said that, she just read this morning that some companies trying to do uranium mining. Is there any positive? She's asking, is there anything positive about that for the Navajo people?
Oftentimes when these corporations come in, and they want to develop the lands for mining or extraction, it's often done under the banner of economic development, but it hasn't helped us in the last 200 years. I don't know why they expect a different outcome. And also, if the reason that the reason I believe that this is very intentional, we're kept intentionally oppressed, is because it would be cheaper for us to be self-sufficient. It would be much cheaper for the government just to let us build our own economy, have access to our lands, be completely self-sufficient. That it's not is a concern and speaks to maybe a different you know, there's a reason we're in this situation. So as far as how you can help advocacy and providing platforms for Indigenous people to speak, there's so many of us, but very few of us on the global stage. I know I was sitting in a meeting with our representative in Arizona, and it was when COVID hit, and he was trying to provide resources for small business, and they were talking about PPP loans. The application for a PPP loan, you had to have a physical address. That just cut out 90% of small business owners because we don't have physical addresses. We all rely on PO boxes, and they did not accept the PO box.
Mm.
So my job is to advocate for business owners that have these obstacles. And I do that by, you know, joining boards or joining groups or giving my voice to groups. And I can only do that because I have privilege, and I understand that. And it's up to me to use that privilege to help others, because Indigenous people are very community oriented, and it goes against the grain of American individualism. So it's hard for people to understand why I would give up my restaurants, or why I would, because I don't succeed without my people. It's not success. Success is an individual. So that's something that we need to reinstill. Because you don't, you know, even in business school, I was sitting there and they were telling me that Bill Gates pulled himself up by his bootstraps and did it all on his own. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There, thousands of people have helped me in my business journey, from mentors to my customers, to my community, to my friends that helped me build my restaurant, to my food providers, my vendors. We're a community. How is this perceived as being an individual act? It never made sense to me. So these conversations need to happen. We need to realize that we're part of the community. We're a global community, and we don't succeed without each other.
Beautifully said. Joe, you have your hand up.
Well, and I got a picture up, so you at least not staring.
Yeah, your lips aren't moving, but
no, that's maybe a good thing. 'Cause if my lips are moving, I might be lying. Jimmy Note and the Colorado Plateau Foundation, you must be familiar with them.
I don't know a lot about them.
Okay, well, Jim was here last week. We had lunch together and visited, and I just asked him what's going on with the foundation, and they're focusing on, of course, the Colorado Plateau Foundation is a foundation run by Indigenous people that fund Indigenous organizations. And as someone who likes to, you know, when I have a few extra dollars, I like to send them where they're going to do some good. And I've kind of relied on Jim's organization because I trust an Indigenous organization to help other Indigenous organizations better than, say, something that's all run by Anglos. But they're currently working on helping Indigenous farmers come up with more drought resistant methods and crops, because that's where we're headed. We're talking about this drought, but it's really the new normal until we pull our head out of the oil bucket. And I just, what are your favorite, where would you point a person who wants to make donations to get the biggest bang for the buck?
Let's see. So right now I'm supporting, they're called Chishi Farms. And let me share my screen with you.
Okay.
So Chishi Farms, when I was working with PNE, I had the opportunity to visit them because they needed water. They were transporting water. And you go to Loop, which is the nearest city, and you take a right and you go for about 15, 17 miles. And it's just sand as far as you can see. And then you crest this hill and there's this beautiful green oasis that Tyrone Thompson has been able to create out in this just arid, dry desert. Oh, that's me. So they're building, he builds hoop houses, and he teaches people how to build hoop houses, and he gets them funded, and he does a lot of teaching. So they're prepping this land. He uses what they call wash irrigation. So they use these washes that water will run down when it rains. He extended them into the nearest water source, which is an aquifer that is still kind of untainted. And this is years and years of work, just years of work. I could find, yeah, here's the water. And they'll just dig and they'll create irrigation. And that irrigation can sometimes go for miles. So this is a farm I really support because he travels all over teaching and sharing his knowledge. Here's a hoop house being built. And you can see the land. But through his irrigation techniques, he's bringing water to his crops.
What's he growing in the?
I'm trying to find everything he's got. He does a lot of greens, a lot of squash, corn. I'm trying to find his crops. They don't have a website, so that's another thing about trying to work on Navajo. It's kind of, you just go, go, go. He doesn't have a website, but he does so much work with people. He's just a phenomenal individual.
I think there was a quote that's coming to me, and either something I read that you had, or that movie, one of those movies. There's healing in the harvest, I think is how it went. Somebody said there's healing in harvesting food.
Yes, so we've always seen food as medicine. And it makes sense, right? So our relationship to the land, it's a reciprocal relationship. And what we put in our bodies is the output that we have. And you can see it when you visit our communities. You can see the toll it's taken on our bodies and our health. So reestablishing that our indigenous foods and our indigenous farms and food systems is a way for us to heal.
Yeah, that's good. Dean, you have a question?
I do. Bleu, I am absolutely inspired by your story, and I want to thank you for your activism and your action, the actions you've taken.
Thank you.
It's fantastic. So if I were to have the privilege of talking to a congressman, senator in the near future, which is likely, what's the script? What's the message? You had mentioned it a few times that a lot of acts of Congress will be necessary, but give me top three, one, two, or three talking points. What should I say?
Well, they're out of touch. They don't know our issues. They don't know what we're dealing with. We need help. I mean, it's going to take structural change. It's going to take change. And so I think I posted somewhere just recently. Sorry, I can't remember what I was saying, but let's see, where is it? Oh, sorry. That's my Hogan. Let me see if I can find it. Sorry, this is important to the conversation. Okay, so I said I'm prepping for a panel this evening In 1923, the Navajo Tribal Council was formed by the federal government. The concept of a central governing body was foreign to the Navajo people. The tribe had originally consisted of many family groupings or clans, each having their own leader called Nathani, speechmaker, who was chosen by the clan and removed by the same process. Tribal councils, on the other hand, were political entities set up by the US government. Even today, they cannot make binding decisions without the signature of the Secretary of the Interior. So when I go to these council meetings, when I go to these council meetings, we're talking about change and we're talking about developing these programs. And all my tribal leaders are sitting there in the chamber. Behind them is the government official. And it's literally like the Wizard of Oz, where he's back there pulling the strings and making, you know, this veil of progress when literally nothing has changed. So until we have more autonomy, because they call us sovereign, we're not truly sovereign. Until we have more autonomy, nothing is going to change. I can open a business in a week, and I have. I can apply for an EIN, I get it in 5 minutes. I can apply for a business license, I have physical addressing, I can get my utilities hooked up in a week, and I can be up and operating. I'm on year 6 trying to get a business up and operating on Navajo because there's no buildings, and I had to share that space, and they kept trying to shut Blackbird down because we were missing a comma, or we didn't have the correct this or that, or they even came in one time and they said, you need to have another restroom. And I said, based on what? There's no code. If it's occupancy, I have 16 seats. Show me in the code where it says I have to have another restroom. It didn't exist. So there's a lot of miscommunication. Nothing is digitized. It was written 40, 50 years ago, and it hasn't really been updated since. The only economic process we're going to see is by supporting micro business. We have an economic leakage of 24 hours, meaning they get paid on Friday, it's gone by Saturday night. None of that revenue stays in our community. It all leaks to the border town. We generate billions of dollars. All of it goes to the border towns. We've made millionaires in those border towns. The first lease negotiation for Peabody coal, we were getting 15 cents per ton. 15 cents per ton. The much mineral extraction, coal, uranium, copper that has taken place, we should be one of the richest nations in the world. We're the poorest. These are systemic and political issues. How do you fix that? How do you tackle that? I don't have time. I don't have time to wait for it to move through the government. So I'm going to take my solution of sharing resources, sharing knowledge, because if I can create a space, if I can invest, find a temporary structure, fabricate it so it's like a kitchen in downtown LA, and I can share the burden of that, entrepreneurs will have less risk. They'll need less startup capital. We don't have access to capital. We can't have mortgages. So even if you have a home on Navajo, you can't get a mortgage on it. You can't get it insured. It's not an asset. Nobody will touch us because they can't prosecute on Navajo land. So we don't have access to capital. There's so many issues that needs to be addressed, but we're out of time. So the best we can do, again, is share resources. Sorry, I get riled up.
You know, Bleu, I do work through the Latter-day Saint Church with African refugees, and it sounds much like a refugee camp.
Yep.
I mean, they can't. When you're in a refugee camp, you can't work. You don't have like the things you need to be able to be productive. So you have these vast tracts of land we call reservations that are basically refugee camps. This is terrible.
Yes and no, because I grew up there. I grew up on the Navajo Nation. I grew up in my grandmother's hogan. I walked 4.5 miles to the highway to get on a bus to go to school. It wasn't a burden to me. It was actually probably the best time of my life because of my brother always, you're not a victim. This is an adventure. It's all perspective. This is how we look at it. Learn from this. Build and grow and appreciate this. And so for me, from the outside, it looks just like a desolate, or sometimes we're called a third world country. There's a lot of poverty porn regarding our situation. But for me, it's beautiful and there's opportunity. I mean, we have the opportunity, if you really look at it, to leapfrog over the infrastructure that is happening in the United States that is crumbling and will continue to crumble, and it's unaffordable to repair most of it, and go straight into green technologies. I mean, that's a beautiful thing for me. So again, it's just the perspective. We want to keep our culture intact. We want to preserve our lands. We don't want to just throw up a bunch of concrete infrastructure that doesn't do anything. We want to look at renewable and sustainable technologies when we're building, but we need a plan for that, and we need support for that, and we need the ability to do that. So you can't come into the community and just shoehorn an environment like you're used to in the city. It's not going to work. There's familial ties to the land. There's respect for the animals that exist there. We're looking at soil reclamation. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we can't do that if our communities don't have access to nutrition. If you don't have nutritious food, even your brain can't produce myelin, which is a necessary component for innovative thinking. So let's start with nutrition. Let's start with providing healthy food, access to healthy food, and then we can start building from there. For us, the definition of wealth is our well-being, mental and physically. That's what wealth is. It's not owning a bunch of cars, a bunch of homes. That's antithetical to what we believe in. That's antithetical to our cultural beliefs.
So Bleu, back to Dean's thing, is it possible to have you or someone write like these top 3 things that you would like congressmen to hear, so that I can send this out and we can write letters? But I think we need your language, your perspective, and that we can add a little bit to it, but just to kind of copy and paste and work from something better than a one-night meeting where you've articulated things wonderfully, but we're not taking notes and stuff. I mean, this is being recorded, but is it possible for you to do that? And I'll post it on the website and send it out.
Absolutely. And I actually prefer many voices to just my one.
Right.
And again, because I'm speaking on behalf of my people, not for my people.
Sure.
And I always,
you mean the other way around, for your people? No.
Well, yeah.
Yeah,
on behalf
of
of my people, not for my people.
Right.
And I try for these not to be ego-centered. I'm learning as much presenting to you and getting your feedback and hearing you and even seeing your expressions. And that's really important to me. So I would love to include other people that are doing this work. There could be different perspectives. I know a lot of people think differently from me. They want just a cookie cutter environment like you have in the city. So oftentimes they ask, what kind of businesses should we open? Oh, Panda Express. Oh, we need a Walmart. And I'm like, no. Have we learned nothing? So, but I would appreciate other voices on this matter, and I appreciate your offer. So absolutely.
Yeah.
I'll put my email in the chat.
Okay. And then if you can, again, I think Dean pointed to something really valuable, because you talked about how our government is really holding you back, and it would take an act of Congress. So what would that act of Congress be? What do you and others envision? What needs to change to make things work better so that we can start advocating? I mean, we could start a change.org thing. I mean, there's all kinds of things besides congressmen, but we need something, you know, for it to happen, it needs to be somewhat succinct that people can grab a hold of and start carrying around. You know what I mean?
It's a hard sell because honestly, it's true sovereignty. It's autonomy. We don't have it.
And what would that look like? What would that look like stuck within this country? What needs to happen?
So basically, and we call ourselves nations because that's how we functioned. We were smaller nations. How are we going to convince people to let us be a nation within a nation? It's a hard sell. And we do still have quite a lot of resources under our feet. So there's that.
Yeah.
And then it's going to take decades of education. People aren't even aware when we travel. I had my co-founder at Native Women Entrepreneurs traveled to Mongolia. They were convinced we didn't exist anymore, that we were wiped out.
Wow.
So, you know, the social media has helped tremendously, but it's also kind of, it's this weird space to be in because people have, you know, in movies we're portrayed through a historical lens, and then you meet someone like me and they're like, you don't sound native or you what, and I'm like, ugh. It's always the education. So every room I'm in, every conversation that starts, I have to start back in the 1800s. Okay, this is how we got here. So I honestly, I don't expect to see a whole lot of change in my lifetime, and many of the activists agree, but we're still willing to lay the foundation because, like Winona LaDuke says, we think about what happened 7 generations beyond us. American culture doesn't think like that. It's a very individualistic culture, and it's really self-serving, and they're not thinking about generations beyond. But we're running out of time. Our food is not nutritious. We're losing so much of it. I think India's lost like 90% of their rice varieties. This is a real concern. It's a real issue that we need to tackle now. And they took indigenous farming practices, replaced it with monoculture, and monoculture can only yield 1/5 of what indigenous practices can yield. So they were saying we need to industrialize farming and we need to feed this huge population, where they just should have continued. They could have fed everybody. So we need to find our way back to that. And again, that takes advocacy, and it gives giving platforms to indigenous farmers, indigenous food producers, because they still hold that knowledge. They still hold the knowledge on how to heal the land and how to plant and how to build farms in very arid climates. If you research native seed search, they have a lot of drought resistant seeds. Educate yourself on Monsanto and the making seeds property, like proprietary property. How does that happen? How are we letting this happen? So
Yeah.
like for me, I have a small garden because even though I have to operate in the city, and again, we have about a 10% broadband saturation on Navajo, which means 90% of us don't have access to broadband or fast internet speed, so I cannot work there. But yesterday I geocoded my Hogan, and now I can apply for Starlink. So hopefully I can do more work down there. You know, there's solutions. You just got to figure them out, and you got to be really creative. But I can't emphasize more. Just invite us into these spaces, things like this, conversations. Let us speak. We have a lot to share. That's about the best thing that can happen. And then educate, take what you've learned and share it with your neighbors, share it with your family, because it's like a ripple.
Mhm.
It will ripple out through, and things will change eventually. We don't have a choice. We're at a tipping point. Growing up, my elders used to talk about prevention. They don't talk about prevention anymore. Now they just talk about surviving what's coming.
Wow. So Annie has a comment wondering about Deb Howland, the Interior Secretary, the Department of Interior. She's Native American. What, any?
She's one individual in a 500-year system that's been established, and it's only been a few years. I mean, I would hope and pray that she does have some effect, but it's not enough. But it's definitely a start.
It's going to take a lot.
It's going to take a lot.
Yeah. So besides maybe writing people like her and our congressman and just trying to get that out there as much, are there any platforms out there already, activist platforms that represent your people that we should be contributing to in terms of our voice and our energy and even financially, that so that we, you know, so that there's some strength in numbers there? Are there?
Absolutely. I would recommend looking for grassroots organizations and helping them with capital and support. They're often the last rung on the ladder as far as access to capital. Like the big NGOs get a lot of money, but then they end up having this big administrative costs, where small grassroots organizations like me, most of my work is volunteer. With P&E, all I got was some gas money. That was it. We even had Jeep Chrysler donate their Jeeps to us so we could transport. Like these grassroots, they move quicker. The bigger you get as an NGO, the more hoops you have to go through, the more board members you have to appease, the more donors you have to answer to, etc. But the grassroots can move quickly, and they do. Like Chishy Farms is a grassroots effort. There's a lot of maker spaces and incubators that are popping up that are grassroots efforts. I would look for those. Above those, there are some organizations like Native Women League in New Mexico, Community Capital in New Mexico, Change Labs in Arizona, Grand Canyon Trust. Those are really good organizations too. I'll tell you that the way advocacy works, James Beard approached me. I've been working with James Beard for years, working with them and attending their events. And they asked if I would be on the committee for the Black and Indigenous Food Fund, which is a fund that provides $15,000. I think we've distributed about 40 grants of $15,000. But the initial meetings, the application process, again, similar to the PPP loans, the criteria, you had to have a bank account, a business license, EIN, physical address. And again, but the cool thing about James Beard is they listened immediately. I said, hey, well, we've got these food entrepreneurs that don't have this, and we operate in a cash economy. Many of us operate in a cash economy. We just don't have the structure to participate. We have one bank and it's Wells Fargo, and they're the devil. So it's hard for people to have bank accounts. I only say that because they had a lawsuit. Navajo won a lawsuit against Wells Fargo because of their predatory lending practices to the elders. So I just don't like them.
Sure.
But we don't have these things. So can we talk about, how we can create access to capital for them? And they changed their whole criteria. They changed it to, well, if these food stands, if you've ever driven through the res, you see these side of the road food stands or burrito ladies. They're selling food on the side of the road. if they just took pictures of their product, maybe a menu, a letter from the community supporting them, they became eligible. And we were able to fund these little tiny food people with, and this was 15,000 for that kind of operation is significant. But without the advocacy, they would never have known the situation that we're up against. So that's why I'm always a proponent. Just tell our story. Tell it. You know, it's different out here. It's very difficult, and we don't have access to a lot of things.
Other questions or thoughts? Alan, do you have anything? You're into business and such. If you're behind your picture still.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm doing a lot of listening. I do find it interesting that you know, the person that's really behind feeding the homeless in Salt Lake is
Yes, Carl.
yeah, and one of the guys that's on the ground doing all the cooking is Dave John,
Dave. Yep.
who I went to high school with.
Oh,
And
awesome.
so, you know, we did dinner with him, and it's just interesting to me that the people who understand how to take care of people, and I learned more tonight why, because success is about people, it's not about individuals. And
Yep.
he really has dedicated much of his, well, pretty much all of his free time to trying to help the homeless go from week to week. And I don't know that I have any words of wisdom. It's been more of a listening night for me, but I certainly have some action items to do now.
What would they be? Just
Well,
to inspire the rest of us.
certainly reaching out to our representatives in the government is essential. And I have found they sometimes respond. So depending on how you do it. I know one time I sent them all checks with hopes and prayers written on the check instead of dollars. And I had a nice long conversation with Representative Curtis after that. So sometimes you have to get a little creative to say, you know, your normal response is just not adequate, but we have hundreds of years of terrible actions toward our native nations. And I think we just have to start stepping up, and those of us who are not native have to step up and start talking loudly.
Yeah. Good
The
thought.
best piece of political advice I ever got was to get the ear of the eighth, because they're the ones that are taking issues to the political figures. And they're the ones in close proximity and in rooms with them. And if you can get them interested, they'll carry your voice to them.
Who is
And
that
you're more
again?
effective that the eighth.
Oh, the AIDS. Good.
That's a good thought. Didn't realize that. Joe, you have your hand up again.
And I'll unmute. Just another thing that came to my mind is, Bleu, are you familiar with Milo Fowler?
No.
He's a Dine man who, last I heard, he lives up here in Utah, but he travels all over the Southwest, electrifying remote hogans and settlements with solar, mostly using Goal Zero technology.
Yes, I've worked with Goal Zero.
Yeah, and he's on Facebook, he's on Instagram. That's where I know him from. He's a very well-known photographer as well. I mean, very good work. But he channels all of his resources into traveling around, electrifying very remote settlements and individual households, and I mean, just boots on the ground. And you can, like I say, you can find him on Instagram and Facebook, and I'm sure there's a way to link up and send him some good green folding medicine.
Would you put his name
Sure.
in the chat? Thanks, Joe. And then several of you have put some things in there. So any suggestions you have in the chat, that would be great. Anybody else? We're at to 9 o'clock, so got to the end. Anybody else have any questions? Want to say anything? Yes, James.
I just want to say, Blue, this was so enlightening for me. Both Karen and I we were just sort of astounded at this history. And what also impresses me is this effort to do things through community and locally, initiatives that are generated just on such a small scale. I really appreciate your work, and I was really kind of astounded at what you explained. It's really changed my perspective quite a bit.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It has been really good, Blue. I would encourage you, it doesn't cost anything to watch that YouTube Broken Arrow. I mean, that chronicles the history that Blue talked about and dramatizes it. And I don't know, you just go, I can't believe this terrible stuff happened. I mean, I've read some of it, Trails of Tears and stuff like that. But there's just so much that, we just came through this time of Black Lives Matter and kind of this more awakening to things like that. And I mean, we have our own indigenous people here that are continuing to suffer, and we are holding down because of systemic, I mean, we could call it systemic racism. It's the same ideas and things that are going on here that need to be addressed. So let's just be creative. I love Alan's idea of checks with hopes and prayers, and you guys are all creative people. So let's think of ways that we can push this forward. This is really a critical, it strikes me as, again, a member of the Latter-day Saint faith. We have, Joe was mentioning this as we were talking earlier today, Joe Benyon, that we as a church maybe have treated indigenous populations a little bit better than some, but at the same time, we've also tried to use them, at least in missionary efforts and stuff, to our advantage, trying to leverage, our concept of at the time with the Book of Mormon and stuff. And then we've just done some terrible things. We've exploited the land. I just listened to the Pope's encyclical on the environment. That's, I don't know, maybe 8 years old now. Yeah, I think you can get it free on Audible. Listen to it. And because Christianity, its history is a mixed bag, and it's not been so good at times with indigenous peoples at all. And then even in terms of an environmental thing, but, I think the Pope in this writing is really trying to heal that and to bring us around to a better place. Some really valuable things there that could, again, be motivating in terms of Christianity joining forces with indigenous people and their beautiful stories. I mean, we have our stories, they have our stories. We have some beautiful things together that those things teach us about the land and how critical it is.
Unfortunately, our LDS history is not all great. The
The
Bureau of Indian Affairs leader that really stripped the Utes of their land was LDS.
Yeah.
The Intermountain Indian School process was not a good thing.
No.
And so it really is, I don't even know what the right word is, but it's ridiculous that we somehow thought ourselves superior to so many different kinds of people in the United States, this white group that somehow thought they were superior. And it's time for the white group to stand up and say, no more. We're not doing this any longer. Everyone is equal in the eyes of our Creator, and we just can't stand for it any longer. So I really loved the meeting tonight, and I've done a lot of reading of Native American writings in the last couple of years, and I don't know the answer, but that we have to stand up and say no more.
Thank you, Alan.
There are quite a few issues in Utah itself that are not really being addressed. Part of the reason
Phil Lyman comes to mind.
I'm doing this work, my mom fought the transport of the spent uranium rods. I don't know if any of you were aware of that. They were trying to move them into the Goshute Valley, the Goshute Reservation. There's like 100 or something members. It's a very small tribe. It was a lot of this nuclear waste they were trying to bring into Utah, I believe from Yucca Mountain.
Yeah.
And she created a nonprofit called Environmental Justice. And she raised millions of dollars over the course of 10, 15 years to pay the lawyers to fight this. Because again, they were telling the Goshute people, well, this will give you money and it will stimulate your economy and all of this stuff. But every time they won the case, the parent company would just develop a new LLC under another name and the whole process would start over. And this went on for many, many years. And again, it was millions of dollars. And she was lucky to have such a supportive team around her that they were able to raise these funds. But, you know, you think about causes that go unfunded and the atrocities that happen and continue to happen. And people aren't aware. It just happens under their radar. Many people in Utah weren't aware of that they would be downwind from this contamination and what it would do to the farmlands, the farming areas. So just, you know, educating yourself and supporting causes and talking to your community, talking to your families. That's how we prevent a lot of these atrocities from happening. And, you know, it's sometimes it's hard to acknowledge the histories, but it is a history, and history is often filled with lessons. But if we're ignoring those lessons, we're not learning, and we're leaving ourselves open to the history possibly repeating itself, which we're actually seeing now in areas of the world. So I think that's why it's important to have these conversations, acknowledge, yes, these happened, acknowledge that it's continuing to happen. We still believe that we're in a genocide because we're still being oppressed and we're still being denied access to food in 2022. So being aware is the first step, and then take action. And, you know, this benefits everybody. This isn't just for Indigenous people. We have knowledge we can share, and that can benefit the globe. We just need the opportunity to speak on it. We need spaces, invited into spaces. So thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. I was happy to see all of your faces, and I put my email if anyone has any further questions or interests, and you can reach me there.
Thank you so much, Bleu. It's been a really useful, helpful evening. Hopefully we can be of some help to you. And folks, this is a mother of 5 that's been doing all this stuff. So that's just an inspiration. Oh my God. Yes.
One last note, watch Gather on Netflix. It talks specifically about the food system and the things that are occurring right now that everybody should be thinking about. That's going to affect everybody. So it's a really beautiful film.
Yeah, it is nicely done. It's the quality of it's much nicer than Broken Rainbow, but Broken Rainbow is powerful. I just think super powerful, but in terms of historical understanding of what you covered in the first part of your presentation. Yeah, I kept having to pause and take notes. You know, it's just, gosh, crazy stuff.
You are brave, Bleu. I just had to say that. You're very brave. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, you really are. Thank you so much, Bleu, and everyone else. Thanks for being here tonight. I think it's time well spent. I appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you next month. Okay.
Thanks,
Well, have a
guys.
good night.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Hey, Blue.